If you're in a bad situation for your rights, you use every tactic and every strategy and every weapon you have.
On a whites-only train car in 1892, Homer Plessy stood and announced to passengers that he was breaking the law. Plessy's challenge would embolden generations of ordinary people to test laws in the courts, revolutionizing the way minorities everywhere fight for their rights.
The plaintiffs now, in these court cases, showed enormous courage facing the consequences, both violent and nonviolent, of taking a stand.
At the end of the Civil War, 3 new constitutional amendments promised a new day for African Americans. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment guaranteed equal protection of the laws to all citizens, and the 15th Amendment granted African Americans the right to vote. Now armed with a political voice, the minority population succeeded in voting many of their own representatives into state and even federal legislatures. By 1870, 7 former Confederate states had elected black politicians to national office, a true demonstration of democratic efficacy. But efforts by resentful Southern Democrats soon decimated the political gains made by African Americans. In February of 1877, federal troops were pulled from the South, allowing Southern state lawmakers to implement poll taxes and literacy tests, disenfranchising African Americans and suppressing their democratic voice. With political representation dwindling, African Americans needed a new way to stand up for themselves. In 1870, Democrats in Louisiana passed the Separate Car Act, which required segregated railroad cars for black and white passengers. 18 prominent black activists in New Orleans united a year later to form the Citizens Committee to test the constitutionality of the Separate Car Act. The Citizens Committee joined forces with the East Louisiana Railroad Company, who opposed the law because of the cost of buying extra railroad cars. Because black Americans had no representation in Congress, the Citizens Committee set out to nullify the law through the courts. And in order to construct a test case, they first needed someone to get arrested, a brave individual to stand against Jim Crow. The Citizens Committee selected a 1/8 black man named Homer Plessy to be their plaintiff, hoping his light skin would allow him to inconspicuously enter a whites-only railroad car. And on June 7, 1892, Plessy successfully boarded the East Louisiana Railroad. When the train began moving, Plessy stood and announced to the conductor that, under Louisiana's one-drop rule, he was legally black.
He has to bring his racial ancestry to the attention of the conductor in order to get arrested, which people find absurd. Like, why do you want to get arrested? Because the American legal system has these requirements for challenging, I need to actually have been injured.
The railroad company had prepared the conductor. He stopped the train. Then, a private detective who had been hired by the Citizens Committee stepped onto the train and asked Plessy to exit. When he refused, the detective arrested Homer Plessy. The Citizens Committee appealed to a district court, claiming Plessy's arrest was unconstitutional under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The case ascended the court system, and in 1896, Plessy v. Ferguson arrived at the United States Supreme Court. On May 18, 1896, the Supreme Court upheld the Louisiana segregation law in a 7-1 ruling. The majority opinion argued that separate facilities could be equal. Justice Henry Brown wrote, "The 14th Amendment could not have been intended to abolish distinctions based upon color or a commingling of the two races." The decision introduced a new social doctrine, separate but equal. Now armed with a constitutional basis for segregation, states throughout the South passed laws mandating stricter separation of the races. Instead of ending segregation, Plessy v. Ferguson had ushered in the era of Jim Crow. But despite its adverse social impact, Homer Plessy's stand demonstrated the potential for test cases to empower minority groups. Seeing this potential, Black activists in New York founded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, in 1909. They set out to fight racist legislation through the courts by enabling individuals to take a stand. Their mission? To end Jim Crow. For the first half of the 20th century, the NAACP used Plessy's tactic of test case litigation to fight for equality. In 1917, they challenged a Louisville housing segregation law with Buchanan versus Warley, a manufactured test case. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the NAACP, striking down the housing segregation law as unconstitutional. And then, in 1954, the NAACP began searching for plaintiffs to prepare an all-out assault on segregation. They quietly approached parents at meetings and asked them to try enrolling their black children in white schools. Knowing they would be rejected, the NAACP readied to suit. Their case ascended the courts, and on May 17, 1954, Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren handed down a unanimous decision that shook the nation. The court ruled that separate facilities were inherently unequal, overturning Plessy and effectively bringing an end to Jim Crow. After Brown, test case litigation exploded. Other civil rights organizations joined the NAACP in utilizing the tactic. All across the nation, minorities began finding plaintiffs to stand up for their rights in court. In 1965, Estelle Griswold of Planned Parenthood incriminated herself for selling birth control, securing nationwide contraceptive rights for married couples. Almost a decade later, Jane Roe offered her story anonymously to a group of pro-choice lawyers, winning the constitutional right to abortion. And then, in 2015, the ACLU sued on behalf of James Obergefell for his husband's marital status to be recognized in death, and the Ohio test case legalized gay marriage nationwide. Individuals everywhere won rights for thousands of marginalized Americans by taking a stand in the model of Homer Plessy.
So Homer Plessy's action created two different precedents. One, the awful precedent of separate but equal. But Plessy versus Ferguson also created the precedent of ordinary people going before a public body like the courts and ultimately the Supreme Court, and using that body as a means to try to uphold the 14th Amendment.
But not everyone supported this revolutionary tactic. Some people felt that legal organizations were using their plaintiffs as pawns to subvert majority rule. Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia articulated this view in his scathing dissent of a 2003 decision which legalized homosexual conduct.
Let me be clear that I have nothing against homosexuals or any other group promoting their agenda through normal democratic means. But persuading one's fellow citizens is one thing, and imposing one's views in absence of democratic majority will is something else.
But despite its criticism, Plessy's strategy of constructing test cases remains an indispensable form of minority political expression.
I understood the strategy and I didn't have any problem with it. And while I have great respect for Justice Scalia, the people would not have voted for Brown versus Board of Education when the court decided that. The people would not have voted for many of the rights that we hold dear. The Constitution is a guardian of the rights that people should have, whether they have political power or not.
In the final analysis, Plessy versus Ferguson was more than just a landmark Supreme Court case. Despite the negative outcome of legitimizing segregation, Homer Plessy's orchestrated stand succeeded in introducing a new tactic of test case litigation. For the next half-century, the NAACP used test cases to win incremental victories against segregation laws, eventually dismantling Jim Crow. Women, the LGBT community, and other minority groups utilized test cases for the next half-century, winning highly unlikely victories. Their brave plaintiffs became the heroes for entire minority populations. Homer Plessy's defiance inspired an era of minority activism and individual courage, transforming how citizens of democracy have and continue to stand against injustice.